Hello and welcome to Subject to Change with me, Russell Hogg. My guest today is anthropologist Kenji Tierney of SUNY Newports, and he's very kindly agreed to come on the show to speak about sumo. So welcome, Kenji, to the podcast.
Thank you very much. I'm very happy to be able to join you.
Now, you're an anthropologist, so is your interest in sumo as an anthropologist or is it as a fan?
Oh, that's a very good question. My initial interest in sumo was as a fan. The first time I really saw it in person, I was an undergraduate. I went and I did a study abroad, and I was living in Japan, and the sumo tournament came to town. And I was able to secure some tickets and go. It was terribly interesting, terribly fun. I went back a couple more days. And then after that, when I applied to graduate school, I got really interested in my undergraduate era, I was a history major. For graduate school, I wanted to do anthropology, but I wanted to do something that kind of combined the two, history and anthropology. And sumo was this really fascinating kind of world that combined both kind of contemporary Japan, but had this deep, really fascinating historical element to it. So initially, I came to sumo as a fan. Some of my nicer memories of watching sumo were not actually going to the tournament, but it was actually visiting my grandmother, who was still alive at the time. And she would have the sumo tournament on in the afternoon, and I would sit at the kotatsu, the small table, with her, and we would get takeout sushi. And we would watch it on the TV. One of the lovely things about sumo is, as opposed to some other sports, it's terribly easy to understand. It's very straightforward, very simple narratives. The matches are constant and continuous. So it's just a really easy sport to sit back with my grandmother and watch. And so once I got to graduate school, I wanted to continue that interest.
And can we just say what exactly is sumo? You say it's a very simple sport, so what is the idea? Yeah,
it's a straightforward but kind of complex question. At the moment, the dominant category that sumo occupies is sport. But I don't see sumo purely as a sport, and its origins aren't really that. There's this kind of debate among people who study sport about whether sport is something kind of straightforward. You can go around the world and you can identify different sports. Every culture has a sport. The other side is more that sport is a much more kind of a Western conception, that it comes with certain baggages, certain expectations, and it goes and changes things. Sumo has appeared in innumerable forms throughout history. And I think only in the late 19th century did it make this shift over to becoming a sport. So what people watch now, is a tradition-infused sport, but there's a lot of different kind of variations to what it used to be.
So what are the big changes through history then?
Well, sumo, every culture or most every culture has some activity where two people are grappling or wrestling. And so in Japan, sumo is that. But there's lots of different forms of wrestling and grappling, as you know. There's judo and jiu-jitsu and all of these different forms. Sumo, the first recorded instance of sumo was actually the emperor had two of his court attendants, two women, wrestle for amusement. And so there was, it could be like a court ritual. It could be a form of amusement. You could have wrestling matches at shrines or temples. You could have one-person sumo, where it's an individual wrestling against an imagined god or a spirit. You had sumo that was competitions. You had sumo where it was really just to display the bodies because the bodies are interesting. It's only in the 19th century when you had this idea of competition and exercise and the physical culture movement and everything coming over to Japan that sumo has to change, has to transform into a sport to fit into kind of the modern world.
You say it changes in the 19th century. Is that with the opening up to the West, or does it happen a bit before that?
Oh, it's very clearly linked to the opening of the West. So one of the really kind of fascinating moments in sumo history is Commodore Perry, the American, came to open up Japan. He came in 1853, basically said, I'll be back next year. I'm going to negotiate a treaty. Be ready. So he went off, and then he came back. And it was pretty clear to the shogunate, the rulers of Japan, that they had no military ability to repel Perry. So he came in, they signed a treaty, and it opened up Japan. But when they weren't able to impress Perry with their Japanese military ability, they tried to impress them with sumo wrestlers. The feudal lords of the time often had top wrestlers that they as patrons, and the wrestlers would travel around the country and have the feudal lords mark on their ceremonial aprons. So it was a very standard practice. And so the top wrestlers were assembled, and after the treaty was signed, Perry and his men were brought to this clearing. They were sitting in this nice house, and they were essentially forced to watch sumo as the wrestlers grappled. And after that was done, Perry was brought out and made to basically grope the wrestlers to see how strong they were.
So yeah, see what you're taking on if you take on Japan.
Right. Like, we may not have guns and cannons, and we may have not have been able to do anything militarily, but we do have very big people here. And then Perry immediately identified sumo as a sport. He compared them to the catch and ken wrestlers that were very popular in the United States. So he kind of equated it to American or Western style wrestling. Just as a really interesting side note, so after Perry saw the wrestlers on the beach, that later he invited all the Japanese officials on board for entertainment, and they had a big banquet and a feast. And I think they were introduced to they were given a lot of wine, and they got a little bit drunk. And then Perry's men appeared, and they performed a minstrel show for the Japanese officials. And so there's this moment in time where they're exchanging kind of cultural performances for each other, and one is the sumo wrestlers that quickly became racialized. They were really cast within this understanding of the Japanese race. And then on the flip side, Perry's men performed this minstrel show. And so, yeah.
What do you mean by minstrel show? Sorry, I just want to make sure, because I'm British and it's not necessarily something that we in Britain completely get.
Yes, so minstrel shows were invented in the United States. Actually, they were invented relatively near to where I am now. The first recorded minstrel show was in Albany, New York, the capital of New York. And they were typically white Americans who put on blackface and performed very stereotypical caricatures of African Americans, both freed people and enslaved people. And the legacy of those kind of racialized displays really still informs kind of racial stereotypes of today. So, United States, blackface is completely prohibited. It's just something you don't do. Minstrel shows are this really embarrassing part of American history. So it's rather striking that within 48 hours of meeting Perry and doing a treaty negotiation, they get introduced to American-style racism and racial performances. And it's really, this was the moment where racial discourse was huge. You have Darwin, you have Origins of Species, you have all of this attempt. Another New Yorker, Henry Louis Morgan, an anthropologist, he was central in this idea of delineating the world into the civilized, the barbarians, and the savages, and try and pigeonhole every civilization, every culture, every people within this, three-part hierarchy.
And the Japanese do something of this, don't they, with the indigenous people of Hokkaido in particular?
Oh, yes. Yeah. And so there was this enormous kind of negotiation going on about where do the Japanese slot into this racial hierarchy. They're not white, but they seem really civilized. And so one of the ways that they seem not civilized, one of the ways that they could be knocked down to barbarians, is that they had sumo wrestlers walking around, and they're all naked, and they're big, and they're fat, and they in fact, a couple British observers were very central to this. Yeah. So, for example, Rutherford Alcock, who was the first, British minister of Japan, he, can I read you a quote?
Sure.
So he published this book called Capital of the Tycoon, and he wrote, "Lest we omit the wrestlers, for wrestling is to the Japanese what the ring is to us, and something especially national. Every prince has a whole troop of them, and their pride is to have the biggest, heaviest, and fattest, so that they generally look as bloated, overfed, and disgusting as prize oxen for the butcher at Christmas. This is utterly confounds our ideas of training, that I am at a loss to understand how such masses of flesh and fat can put out any great strength. They strip, and then, squatting opposite each other, look exceedingly like a couple of white-skinned bears or well-shaven baboons." So, yeah.
But what do you make of that? It's,
It was a really interesting time where, many people, anthropologists, Westerners, scholars, were all trying to understand levels of civilization. And you had this idea of the great chain of being, this ranking of humans and animals. So this mobilization of animal imagery, I think, is really important. There was another guy, George Curzon, who also made very similar remarks or observations of the sumo wrestlers. So at this moment where, from the West, there's this enormous critique of the sumo wrestlers as a symbol of Japanese barbarianism, they have to reinvent themselves.
So when you say they have to reinvent themselves, do you mean the Japanese?
No, the wrestlers themselves. Because the Japanese public, Japanese politicians were sensitive to these critiques. They understood how Japan was being presented abroad. And so they understood the weak spots. And so one of these weak spots were the sumo wrestlers. And there was numerous calls for the abolishment of sumo, to get rid of it. This is old tradition. We're a new country. We're westernizing. We don't need these people. Yes, they're naked. They're barbarian. They make us look bad. Let's get rid of it. But luckily, because they had that tradition of feudal lords looking out for them, they had a lot of political allies.
As I recall, in the history of sumo,
yeah,
now it's a fairly rule-bound event. But in many parts of its history, it was a pretty violent affair. So what was the state of play when the first sumo was being shown to the Americans? Was it a very full-on, or was it very rule-bound at that stage?
Well, if you talk to the officials within sumo, they like to emphasize the martial history of sumo. But it's many scholars point to the relatively tenuous relationship to that. In the early modern period, so the 250 years before Perry, Japan was enjoying enormous peace. And kind of proto-capitalism. And so the state of sumo was more akin to a circus. It was troops of men traveling around the country, giving performances. One of the huge changes that happened was the invention of the ring. Before this period, there was no ring. And so sumo became this kind of freewheeling display that sometimes involved observers.
So how do you know who's lost if there's no ring? Is it just purely on a fall, or what's the...
So before it was on a fall, or sometimes there were injuries, or actually winning and losing wasn't as important. It was only at the end of the 19th century when they eliminated ties. There was multiple ways to tie during this period, because it wasn't a sport. It wasn't. There were these meets, but they weren't tournaments. These meets have been transformed into tournaments. Before, it was like going to the circus. It didn't matter what day you went. It'd be fun to go see the sumo wrestlers. They would sing folk songs. They'd do feats of strength. They'd do acrobatics. And maybe at the end of the day, there'd be some wrestling. But that might not be the main reason why you go. There was a famous wrestler, Daidozan, who became the toast of Edo. He became this really popular wrestler. Sharaku, the famous ukiyo-e master, did multiple prints of him, and he was just, the public was riveted by him. Well, he was this boy who was overweight, and he was just this really fascinating body to look at. And so he was brought into the ring, and he did the ring entering ceremony, the dohyo iri, and everybody would gawk at him, and that would be like amazing, and then they'd go away. And so you would have what are called kanban rikishi, so these sign.
Now, just hang on.
Yeah.
I don't think we've introduced what the rikishi is.
Oh, yeah. So rikishi are sumo wrestlers, and the characters look, power.
So what's the difference? Sorry, what's the difference between a sumo wrestler and a rikishi?
Oh, rikishi is just the one of the native terms for the wrestler. Yeah.
And is it different? Because I know a little bit about the Japanese language. So you've got the kanji for sumo, I think,
yeah.
And then presumably you have different kanji for rikishi. So what are the kanji saying in sumo and rikishi?
So sumo is more of an ancient. It has more of a longer history behind it. It means like the meeting of people. It comes from sechie. And then rikishi is more kind of militaristic. It has kind of like power and soldier into it. And so depending on the context, it might be deployed in different ways. I think the Sumo Association prefers the word rikishi, but in Japan it's often Osumo-san, so just Mr. Sumo is a very standard kind of way of referring to them.
So where should we go? Shall we talk a bit about how sumo sort of develops as part of the way the Japanese see themselves in the modern period and sort of the 20th century?
Absolutely. That story is quite fascinating. So getting back to your original, the previous question, when Perry showed up and was shown sumo, it was very much this kind of spectacle sumo, where you had troops of wrestlers going around the country, and sometimes it was men and sometimes it was women. And they were basically this profit-making show of people. And they performed for all these audiences, high and low. And so...
Sorry, can I just ask a question there? Because you say it's men and women, and I know now women are, completely forbidden from, setting foot anywhere near the ring, really.
There was different troops of people, and there were all of these venues where people could perform. One of the interesting things about early modern Japan is there wasn't really public spaces. So there were spaces like in temples, in shrines, where you could put on a performance and you would split the gate receipt with the hosting institution. And then there was these kind of liminal spaces where you competed against other forms of entertainment. And oftentimes the forms of entertainment were pretty, it could be martial skills, so people putting on sword fighting displays. There's jugglers, there's animal cruelty. One of them was a dancing cat, where they would put cats onto heated drums and they would just be dancing around. It's, to the 21st century eye, not so nice. And so the sumo wrestlers are competing against that. They're competing against the geisha. They're competing against the really disreputable kabuki. And so it's not like it was this honor-bound society of rules and upstanding people. It was, capitalism.
I got to stop you there. What do you mean, the disreputable kabuki?
Well, kabuki started off as basically on the riverbanks of Kyoto, and now it's seen as, traditional and something worthy of seeing, not as high class as say no, but originally, the kabuki actors, it was men and women, but there was too much prostitution, so they banned women, and then there's still too much prostitution, so they forced the young male actors to shave their forelocks to make them less attractive. Kabuki was not seen as it was very much a disreputable form of entertainment. It was very bawdy, and so the wrestlers are competing against this. Like many institutions, the longer they stay around, the more traditional they seem and the more higher class it might seem. But the origins of kabuki are, it's fascinating because it started out with women doing it and then it got taken over by men, and now it's seen as something that tourists want to see, or, oh, you go to watch kabuki, how nice of you. But when it started off, it was terribly disreputable. And so the sumo wrestlers, they were traveling, they were fellow travelers in this world. And so, yes, they performed for the Shogun. They performed for, at elite audiences, but they also it was a money-making tour. And so they put on shows that the public liked. And if they wanted feats of strength or acrobatic, that's what they would do. Folk singing was very common, jinku. Said they would give these folk songs, anything to entertain the crowd. And they had these meets where they would give these performances, and they would split the gate receipts with maybe the local strongmen who controlled the area. They would split the receipts with the temple or the shrine, and they'd travel around like that. The travels were amazing. Raiden, who is the most famous historical wrestler, he basically traveled the length and breadth of all of Japan. He didn't go to Hokkaido, he didn't go to Okinawa, but he essentially went to every place else. So it was this really amazing tours that were going on. And then Perry shows up, Japan opens up, and the wrestlers have to change.
So what happens then? What happens to the wrestlers as Japan starts to modernize?
The first, couple decades after Japan opens up, there's this kind of straightforward westernization where bowler hats are coming in and spaghetti and all of this stuff. And there's this kind of disregard or this getting rid of traditional Japan. And so one of the interesting things is up until this point, sumo was modern. Sumo was very contemporary. These were celebrities, right? They were traveling around. They had the latest haircuts, the coolest clothing, and all that. Once it becomes modernized, westernized, then they have to figure out their new role in this new world. And there was attempts to go sport, Western-style sport. We'll cut off the hair. We'll get Western-style athletic haircuts. We'll do it all kind of sports style. But the faction that decided to go traditional won out. And so after, a couple decades, Japan started to become more nationalistic. The emperor was turned into kind of like a European-style royalty. In order for it to work as a royalty, they needed performances for the emperor. The sumo wrestlers volunteered. They kept giving performances for that. Soon it became this traditional thing that they did. There was this really fascinating law that went out that basically said everybody in Japan has to cut their hair. This is in the 1880s. It was the Danpatsu Dattore. And it was an edict went out and it said, we're going to get rid of all the samurai swords and everybody has to cut their hair.
And when you say they have to cut their hair, is this anything to do with like the queue or pigtails that you have in China?
So they didn't have the queue in Japan. They had the top knot.
Right.
But one of the big shifts that was going on was you're shifting from a very hierarchical society to one that's supposedly more democratic. And so the samurai swords and the haircuts were these symbols of feudal Japan.
Right.
And to keep them around was threatening to the new government. So they banned the swords and they banned the haircuts. But both the wrestlers and the kabuki actors made a petition to the government and got an exemption to keep their haircuts. And the kabuki actors eventually gave it up. but the wrestlers have kept it. Yeah.
It's quite interesting because when you cease to be a sumo wrestler, that's the point when you cut your top knot, right?
Yeah. It's a really interesting thing. They have this danpatsushiki, this retirement ceremony where all the people important in your life come and they put a scissors into your hair and cut a few strands. And it's this enormous kind of retirement party that can be quite lucrative. It's interesting, though. The Sumo Association really kind of likes to keep it as a trademark or kind of the branding of the sumo wrestlers. So I've met former wrestlers who have quit sumo but have opened up a sumo-themed restaurant and tried to keep the top knot, as kind of like a marketing thing. But the Sumo Association kept putting pressure on them to cut their hair because, only the wrestlers are allowed to keep it. So, yeah, from the early modern period, there was, dozens of different styles. By the 1880s, it's down to a couple. And so now there are basically two styles. One for the junior wrestlers, one for the top wrestlers.
So Japan is modernized and it's also militarizing.
Yes.
And I suppose the sumo are sort of a symbol of national, strength, is it? Or military prowess? I'm not quite sure. Martial prowess? What's the word I'm looking for? Is there an element in which the sumo are kind of brought into the military project in any way?
Oh, yes. Yeah. It's really interesting. So, it's that the bargain that they have where in order to survive, they have to cultivate and strengthen their relationship to the government. And so that was the displays in front of the emperor. But it was also transforming sumo from this kind of traveling circus to something more akin to kind of a sport or a tradition. So they got rid of all of the extraneous stuff. They get rid of the singing, the feats of strength, and all that. And they focused it purely into a sport. They got rid of the ties, and then they started to declare who's going to be the winner and all of these things. Similarly, there was a lot of politicians, educators, observers who wanted to mobilize sumo as Japan's native sport. So then they had to invent sumo as an exercise. Because before it wasn't really an exercise. And, before the 19th century, people didn't really exercise. They just had jobs where they got their, they didn't have to condition their bodies. They worked. So you had this invention of sumo as an exercise. It became basic training in the Navy, within the military of Japan. It became compulsory exercise in schools.
And by compulsory exercise, you mean that people would have to take part in sort of sumo fights between each other? Is that the idea?
Yeah. And so there's really interesting photographs, or it's just fascinating that the naval ships often had a sumo ring on the deck.
Gosh.
That they would break out, and they would have the wrestlers go and wrestle on the ring. And there was part of it was this kind of propaganda. There was this kind of, one of the tensions that was going on was baseball was incredibly popular, but it was, of course, from America. And so they wanted to push back on that. And so the attempt was to elevate sumo as the native Japanese sport. And so there is this enormous attempt to promote sumo and similar sports such as the newly invented judo or jiu-jitsu, promotion of kendo, which is also similarly transformed, karate, which originally was Chinese hand. The characters meant Chinese hand, but they nationalized it and they turned it into empty hand.
Right.
So there was this, it's an interesting moment where you get the development of what is called the martial arts, which is this kind of weird term that we've come to accept, that somehow smacking someone is an art form. And so sumo was very kind of central to this. One of the really fascinating kind of propagandas that went on is you had the Russo-Japanese War, where Japan just barely won with enormous losses. But that forcing the soldiers to do sumo wrestling, some Western journalists took photographs and they ended up crediting Japanese victories to the strong bodies of the Japanese caused by the sumo wrestling. And so you have this remarkable transformation from these kind of spectacle bodies, these bodies to gawk at, to somehow an aspirational body, or this body that is produced by hard work and patriotism and devotion to the emperor.
So you mentioned something about sumo wrestlers going and starting restaurants and then being pressurized to cut their top knots if they kept one as a marketing ploy.
Yeah.
So what is the connection between sumo? Is there a special sumo food, or what's going on there?
The connection between food and sumo is rather fascinating. Sumo wrestlers eat what is called chonko. Chonko is interesting because it's defined in two different ways. To your typical Japanese, chonko is a stew. Or are you familiar with perpetual stews?
I mean, I know, yes, I guess I am sort of.
Well, I mean, it's very simple. As a practical matter, they get a very large basin or a bowl, and they fill it up with a roiling broth. And the broth changes every day. It can be miso, chicken, any type of flavor. And then the broth boils, and then you add some type of protein. It can be chicken, pork, meatballs, and then tofu and vegetables. And it cooks in there, and what you want, you pull out and you eat with a bowl of rice. So it's a very straightforward dish. It's very easy to use leftovers. Anything that's cheap in the supermarket can go right into it. If you're running a training house, it's a very simple way to feed a bunch of hungry guys.
Why is this a perpetual stew? Do they never clean the bowl? I mean, what happens?
No, they started at the beginning, and eating in sumo is all based on hierarchy. So the top wrestlers eat first. So they get the pick of the best ingredients. So whatever they want, that goes into the bowl, into the broth first. They pull it out, they eat it. And then you eat in order. So, you'll have 5 or 6 guys around the pot eating. Behind them will be lower wrestlers whose job it is to serve them. And so if they finish off their rice bowl, they just hold it up over their shoulder, and the younger guy grabs it and fills it up and brings it back. And so, and then once a wrestler has eaten his fill, he gets up, and then the next senior person sits down and starts eating. And so this is the process that goes in every day.
But this hierarchy, when does it get brought in, this very strict hierarchy? Because it must be about this time, well, after things have modernized, right?
Yeah, well, it's always been very hierarchical, but it's gotten much more kind of firm in is kind of a hierarchy. So one of the issues that exists today is that this strict form of hierarchy is kind of foreign to your average Japanese youth. To join sumo is really kind of going into a foreign land for many Japanese youth. It's not, it's traditional Japan, but it's not something that they're particularly used to. So getting used to, yeah.
How many do join the world of sumo every year? Because there can't be that many slots.
Well, so sumo, anybody can join. It's relatively easy to join. Depending on the number of people who want to join, they have certain requirements about minimum weight, minimum height. But in general, it's relatively easy to join because there is not that much interest in joining. Sumo is a fascinating sport in that it has a very prominent professional organization, but very limited amateur participation.
Right.
Sumo is very unpopular in Japan as a participation sport. It's quite small. One of the more stranger experiences I had is I was doing research in an archive, and it was in this rural museum. And so I went to this museum, and they had this very fascinating archive of like 1920s sumo magazines. And so I was looking through that. But they had an operating sumo ring in the center of the museum, and kids from the area would come to this museum to practice sumo because it was the only ring that was within 45 minutes.
So how many professional wrestlers are there in Japan?
It ranges between like 500 and 1,000.
So it's hardly any.
Yeah, no. And if you ask your average Japanese person, how many active wrestlers can you name? Typically it's about 3, 4, or 5. It's very similar to boxing, where your average person might know the top stars, but know nobody beneath that. So when you join sumo, your job is to be an attendant. It's a very fascinating world in that you have no expenses. You live in the training house. All of your expenses are paid for. It's changed a little bit with the rise of cell phones. Now you might be responsible for your cell phone bill, but where you sleep, your food, your transportation, your clothing, all of those things are provided to you by the training house or the heya. And as a result, your job is to run everything. So they do all of the cooking, the cleaning, the attendance, all that stuff.
So what kind of people do join these sumo houses then?
There's 2 types. There's a variety of types. There's a bunch of types. So one of them, one of the more coveted ones are foreign wrestlers. There is a big tension between the success of foreign wrestlers who have come to dominate it. And similar to other sports, there have been restrictions on the number of foreigners that can be in the sport. So every training house is allowed 1 foreigner. They tend to do rather well.
Why is that?
Because it's very hard to join. And so recently, some of the more successful ones, or the ones that have been incredibly successful, are the Mongolians.
Right.
And they hail from their own tradition of wrestling. Mongolian wrestling is fairly similar to sumo. They come from pretty hard-scrabbled lives. They like wrestling. They're very motivated. And my understanding is the way that they get in at this point is kind of through connections. So they know someone who's a sumo wrestler, and he recommends them to a training house that doesn't have a foreigner. And so it's not an easy or a light decision to join. It's this aspirational thing. And sumo is actually shown in Mongolia, and Mongolians tend to be fairly knowledgeable about sumo. But if you're a Japanese, you can literally walk up to the door of a training house, and if you're of the right age, you can knock on it and say you would like to join, and they will take you in.
And when you join, as you say, it's a pretty tough life, right?
It's both. It's both easy and hard. So in one sense, it's hard because it's very much this apprenticeship system where you go in and they control. It's a total institution, if you know Goffman, where they control everything. But the rules tend to be fairly straightforward. You have a lot of expectations, cooking, cleaning, these type of things. But once you're in there, and if it fits who you are, then it isn't that bad. One of the big problems with sumo is that there's a lot of wrestlers who want to quit, but they know that quitting is enormously hard because if they join relatively young, maybe when they're a high school kid, maybe they don't have a high school degree, they've never worked a job and received a salary, they've never lived on their own, maybe they don't have a driver's license, so it can be very difficult once they leave.
Right. So you're saying they're pretty institutionalized after they've been there a few years.
Yeah. And so getting back to Chanko, that's actually one of the routes out of sumo. The interesting thing is when you're starting out, you're trying to be really good in the sumo ring, and food is this like means to get bigger and stronger. But once you see the writing on the wall and you realize maybe you don't have a future in sumo, then many wrestlers turn their eye more closely to the chanko. And if you can get what is called chankoban, or the head of chanko, or the preparation of it, then it's getting similar to being in a restaurant where you're in charge of the daily meal. You're in charge of what they're going to eat. You send out all the wrestlers and say, okay, I got the flyers. This supermarket is having a sale on tofu. You go there and you buy that. This other one is having a sale on cabbage. You go buy that. All right, you're going over to the fishmonger. He's a patron. He'll give you a good price on some salmon. Go talk to him. And so you're organizing a whole crew of people. You're putting on a meal. You're running a budget. And this can be practical skills that can help you leave.
And why have I never come across a Chanko restaurant? Because I've been to Japan quite a few times, and I don't think I've even heard of a Chanko restaurant.
It's a tough business. It's strange because.
But how many restaurants are there that do Chanko? I eat out a lot in Japan. I just never come across one.
There are hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of Chanko restaurants, but it's a tough business.
And where are they? Are they mainly in Tokyo, or are they spread around the country?
Not surprisingly, there's a lot of Chanko restaurants near the Sumo Stadium. So tourists will go and they'll watch Sumo, and then afterwards they'll go to a Chanko restaurant. And then you can't really have competing Chanko restaurants because it's not as popular. And so wrestlers might go back to their hometown and open up a Chanko restaurant or something like that. Problem is, either you have to trade in celebrityness. So if you're a top wrestler and people know you and they want to go and try your Chanko, or you have to come up with another way to sell it. Part of the problem is it's a hot stew. And so, it's delicious in winter, but in summer it's a harder sell. So a lot of these guys who quit will go and manage other restaurants, possibly open up a restaurant of their own. Maybe it won't be Chanko themed, but it can be. Opening up a Chanko restaurant it's difficult. I've met many owners. Oftentimes they have to retain kind of relationships to the sumo world, trying to get people related to sumo to come visit to their restaurant, these type of things. Yeah.
You mentioned that the guy in charge of cooking the Chanko for the sumo, he's saying, there's a good deal on with this supplier, and the fishmonger knows us, so we'll get a good deal there.
Yeah.
And I'm just thinking, is money tight in the sumo world? Is getting the economy of the hair right terribly important? What's going on there?
Yeah. No, one of the really fascinating things about sumo is that there are training houses, and they're kind of independent. They'd be almost like a team, and they're kind of independent contractors. It's always run by a retired wrestler and his wife. It's their job to recruit individual wrestlers. And depending on how many wrestlers you have, what rank they are, you receive a stipend from the association. And with that stipend, you have to provide for your wrestlers. Above and beyond that stipend, there's this really fascinating world of patrons, the patron network, and the managing of the patron networks is central to sumo. And so the top wrestlers, sometimes the majority of their income comes from patrons.
And what does that mean when you say patrons? I don't quite understand.
So, it's similar to, say, patrons of the art, people who are interested in it. One of the really unique things about professional sumo is you can just be a fan in the standard way that people are familiar with, where you buy tickets and you go to the event. But with sumo, you can become a patron, a tanimachi of the training houses. And they have parties and they have get-togethers, and they try and cultivate patrons in every different industry that they need. So they'll have the fishmonger to provide fish. They'll have farmers who will provide rice and vegetables. I knew a guy who worked for, I believe it was ANA, so all Nippon Airways, and he could provide plane tickets. And they had patrons who were realtors that could find them apartments when they're traveling. So they get patrons in every different industry, and then there's this constant kind of cycle of gifts between they send out the ranking sheet before every tournament, or they invite them to parties at the training house. The top patrons will have the wrestler will go out drinking and eating with the wrestlers. They'll invite them to their end of the year party. They'll invite them to their daughter's wedding. And so you can have a very intimate relationship with the wrestlers where you have, depending on how much money you offer, you have access to the wrestlers. And one of the tensions that goes on with the wrestlers is the kind of the demands of sport, where you're a professional athlete, you got to train your body, you have to stay healthy. And then the patrons, some are very good and very thoughtful, but others want to go out drinking with the wrestlers during the tournament. And there's this general belief that a sumo wrestler can eat and drink anybody underneath the table, and they're often encouraged to do so. So there's this tension because part of their money comes from doing well in the ring, but part of their money comes from these patron relationships that are central to that. And so in the running of the training house, it's often the wife of the stable master, the okami-san, who's really central in these kind of networks of patrons and keeping the finances going. And so with the chanko, they often pick an older wrestler. Sometimes even a retired wrestler will be in charge of really economizing and running it smartly as a business.
I got the sense that, as you say, the wife of the person who runs the heya, she's an absolutely critical part of the operation. And by and large, do they view that as a very fulfilling job, or do they think, oh no, what did I get myself into, this sort of lifetime job that I'm stuck with?
Yeah, no, it's... so if you have a future in sumo and you're a top wrestler, then you might get the right to marry. But
the right to marry, sorry?
Yeah. You can't just get married willy-nilly, because choosing who you want to marry impacts the rest of the world. And so if you're a top wrestler and you're thinking of retiring and becoming a training house master, an oyakata, then it's really important who you get married is up to snuff. So you can't just marry some woman that you met at a bar. So the training house master, his wife, that oftentimes the patrons are very central in deciding what is an appropriate marriage. And so the women who are in it know what they're getting into. And in fact, one thing that happens is there's a system called mukoyoshi, which is this kind of adoption practice that's very common in Japan, where if a family business wants to keep going, they'll adopt in a successful employee to take over. They won't rely on their offspring to always be successful. They'll bring in the most skillful employee. So when someone, a training house master and his wife, if they have children, if they have a boy, if they want to stay in the business, that boy has to grow up and be very successful in sumo to the point where he can take over. But if they have a daughter, she can marry the most successful wrestler in the training house, and they can continue on that way. And that is not an uncommon situation that goes on.
And speaking about the women, I think you said that at one stage there was such a thing as women sumo wrestlers.
Yeah.
But that's now completely gone, right? What's the sort of the history of women as sumo wrestlers?
The history of women's sumo is really fascinating in that it's appeared in every single historical era. So women's sumo keeps appearing and disappearing, appearing and disappearing for the demands of that moment. So one of the fascinating things is that during the early modern period that we talked about, where you had troops of women going around competing with the troops of men to give these performances, they were doing very similar things: acrobatics, feats of strength, eating contests, wrestling, all these type of things. When Perry showed up and it transformed into a sport, the men were able to successfully hook up with the government, transform sumo into a sport and an exercise. They sent some of their wrestlers to war and they put it on their ranking sheets, and they were very nationalistic. Meanwhile, the women continued to try and wrestle, and there was continuous attempts by the government to ban women's sumo. And the number of bans kind of speak to how successful they were in continuing to exist. And just like the men did tours of the colonies and overseas, the women also went all around the world, giving performances, South Pacific, Hawaii.
When would this be?
End of the 19th century, all the way up through the 20s and 30s. Actually, one of the fascinating things is, they talk about sumo as being traditional. The men really transformed sumo into this sport and got rid of all of the traditions. And that early modern style of sumo, that continued until 1964. There were still women's groups traveling around giving these performances where it was the wrestling, the acrobatics, the feats of strength, this whole kind of circus style sumo, this spectacle form. That continued until the 60s. They only got knocked out, ironically, by the Olympics.
Say some more about that. That sounds too good, too good to miss.
So Japan was awarded the 1940 Olympics, and they were going to put those on, but because of the Pacific War, they ultimately got transferred, I think, to Helsinki, and then they were canceled. And so in the 2 decades after World War II, there was this attempt by Japan to get the Olympics back. They got it back in 1964. In the run-up to that, you have the rise of televisions and the popularity of TV sets, and more and more people were buying it. So up until that period, these traveling troops of women could still make a living, be successful by, being traveling circuses coming to town, and people would go and watch it and be exciting. But once the TVs became in every household and people started watching TV, they could no longer make a go of it. And so it was this spectacle, the televisation of the Olympics, that kind of killed this tradition. So I kind of contend that traditional sumo, the women were much more traditional than the men, because they turned it into this weird hybrid sport/tradition, and it's become predominant today. But that style got knocked out in 1964. And just as a side note, while these kind of circus-style women's sumo was going around, the government reinvented women's sumo yet again as a domestic sphere form of exercise. And so there was this belief that, if the Japanese government wanted to have strong soldiers, they needed to have healthy babies and healthy boys. And that starts with strong women. And so they invented women's sumo as this kind of domestic form of exercise. And I don't think very many women ultimately did it, but it was promoted as this way of this Japanese style, this nationalistic style of exercise to create strong women, to produce strong babies that would grow up to be powerful soldiers. And so there was this competition between that traditional spectacle style, the more government-ordained domestic style of exercise. That lasted up through the war, and then the spectacle style ended. And then once you get into the 1980s and 1990s, what happens is Japan, there's two organizations in Japan. They have the professional organization, that's just a big money-making nationalistic organization.
So are you saying nationalistic or national?
National, vaguely nationalistic, because that's how they get their money, appealing to more conservative people. And then you'll have an amateur federation, the Japan Sumo Federation, and their job is to get people to do sumo. And sumo, as I mentioned, is not very popular. Sumo loses out to the much more flashy, much more attractive global sports. Baseball, basketball, soccer are far more interesting and exciting to your average Japanese youth than traditional sumo. So in the 90s, there was this idea that was hatched that if they could get sumo into the Olympics, it could get some of that, shiny Olympic glory and turn around and make sumo more popular as a participation sport within Japan. But when they approached the IOC, they said, well,
there's going to be Japan and maybe Mongolia.
Well, and they,
I suppose the Hawaiians could show up, I suppose.
Yeah, and they said, well, clearly your sport is a summer sport. And we have,
I see.
And we have many, many summer sports. So if you want any chance of getting sumo into the Summer Olympics, it has to be done by both men and women. Uh-huh. It can't just be a male sport. We're not letting in sports for only men. So the Japan Sumo Federation set out reinventing women's sumo. And so they initially called it Shinzumo or New Sumo, and now it's called Joshi Sumo or Women's Sumo. And it's a much more... Originally, the outfits were somewhat ridiculous. There were these custom-made, very modest outfits with not only leotards, but pants over the bottom. And they were custom-made for, I think, about $800. I went to the very first tournament in 1997. It was this interesting spectacle that went on. It's continued to evolve. They've attempted to globalize it. You can now find women's or amateur sumo around the world in very small groups. Both men and women are doing it. Germans have been strong at it. And so women's sumo still exists today. But outside of Japan, it's seen as a sport that can be done. Within Japan, the officials always tie it to these kind of Olympic aspirations. You know, they're trying to use women's sumo as a means to get sumo into the Olympics. And so there's a tension between the participants, and there are many participants who love it and enjoy it and want to continue to do sumo, and then the attempts by officials to use it as a way to get sumo into the Olympics. So women's sumo still exists today. It's on a much smaller scale than the professional level.
I get the sense, and maybe I'm wrong here, but I got the sense that during the bubble economy years, sumo sort of enjoyed a renaissance of popularity amongst the Japanese. And I wondered, A, is that true? And B, how popular is it as a TV spectacle these days?
Yeah, so as I mentioned before, sumo can be very similar to boxing. That wrestlers, the popularity of sumo really gets dependent on individuals. So if a popular wrestler appears and is successful, then popularity in sumo goes up. When I was first watching sumo with my grandmother, there was a brilliant narrative that was going on. You had two brothers whose father and uncle were famous wrestlers. They were the Wakanohana and Takanohana, so the Wakataka brothers, and they were considered the crown princes of sumo. They had this nice family connection. They were handsome. They were very successful, and at the same time, appearing opposite them were the Hawaiians. You had Kunishiki, Akebono, Musashimaru, these very large Hawaiians. Kunishiki, at his peak, was well over 600 pounds. And so you had this great narrative between these kind of native-born, handsome Japanese wrestlers versus these huge Hawaiians who are coming in. And there was always this, like, who's going to win the tournament? Who's going to be more successful? And it spurred enormous popularity. And so they ate well during that period. But one of the problems that happened is, the brothers, through injury, ended up retiring, and the Hawaiians became a little bit more too successful.
Yeah. And
so there was an attempt to pull back from that. It's the Japanese sport, and the fans tend to be older. So to have it completely dominated by Hawaiians was not seen to be a good look. So there was a ban on the recruiting of foreigners until the Hawaiians kind of aged out of the system. And then they relaxed that, but then they went for less obviously foreign-looking wrestlers. So lots of Mongolians came in. But the Mongolians have been enormously successful. Now there's more Japanese who are winning the tournaments, but there was a period of time where it was only Mongolians who were winning. And so you had the national sport completely dominated by a few Mongolians.
When I'm watching boxing, I guess, it goes on for quite a long time, and it's quite exciting because you've got the danger, of real physical injury at all times. When I watch a sumo bout, I feel like I'm missing something because it's over so quickly.
Yeah.
And I don't really understand what I've seen, in the sense that I feel it must be part of some bigger picture, and that it's only if you understand the bigger picture do you start to really enjoy what you're seeing. But is it? I'm not really sure.
Well, as with all sports, there's different levels of enjoyment that go on. One of the nice things about sumo is how quick it is, and so the average match is less than 10 seconds long, and so depending on your tolerance, you can watch upwards. You can watch a couple hundred matches a day if you want to go early enough. To watch the last matches of the day, oftentimes it's different styles of wrestlers. The more you know about them, you can have more of a narrative. During that period where you have the Hawaiians versus the Japanese, there was also a couple particularly small wrestlers who were wrestling and were quite successful, and that was also kind of a thrill for the viewers. To have someone like Kunishiki, who was 500 pounds at the time, going against someone who was not even 200 pounds, or was kind of interesting. So there's different ways to appreciate it. One of the nice things about sumo is you never get trapped in a bad match. Sometimes if you're watching baseball or soccer or football or some other sport, it can get a bit dreary if it gets lopsided or nothing's happening. Sumo is nice in that your palette is always refreshed. There's always another set of people going up. Sometimes they're not terribly memorable, but there's different ways of appreciating it.
I suppose one of the points about the hierarchical system that I've read about is that it matters very much. If you move up the hierarchy, you can escape, a fairly, difficult life by comparison to if you're further up the hierarchy.
Yeah.
So some matches matter a lot to somebody moving up, or they matter a lot to somebody moving down.
Yeah.
And so you get matches where you've got kind of a complete disparity in incentives.
Yeah.
Where for one of the wrestlers, losing may be no big deal.
Yeah.
But for the other wrestler, losing or winning may be a huge deal.
Yeah.
And at that stage, you get some kind of trading of, it might be money, I don't know quite what it is, but there's some sort of, well, maybe cheating is the right word, but the match is effectively fixed. So have you followed the scandals around sumo?
Yeah. The idea of scandal in sumo is really fascinating. The Japanese term for match fixing is yaocho. Yaocho is a really interesting term because yaocho means owner of a supermarket.
What?
Or owner of a green groceries. So a yaoya is like a vegetable stand. Yaocho is the owner. And it comes from the tale of the invention or the origins of yaocho was there was a training house master who would play go with the local greengrocers, who was also a patron. And he knew that if he always beat the greengrocer, he would get mad and he would not get as good of prices on vegetables, or he would not get as many donations. So his strategy was to throw matches. He was constantly losing in go to the greengrocer because it was good for his bottom line. And so I think that term speaks to the larger kind of strategies or the ideas that are going on. That when you're talking about match fixing, as you pointed out, it's if you drop from the top two ranks, you go from a salary of $10,000 a month to something much smaller than that, or from the next level down to going up is the difference between having been successful in sumo and having not. So to have stopped at that level, which the vast majority of sumo wrestlers never make it to that level, is the matter between heaven and hell, as they say. And so you have the importance of that. And a while ago, they changed the system. Before it was the sumo tournament at that level is 15 days long. And if you win the majority of your wins, so 8 wins, you move up. And if you lose the majority, you move down. So for many sumo wrestlers, once they hit that majority, 8, or at the lower levels, it's 7 days long. So if they hit 4, they're good. And I've talked to wrestlers who have said they don't really want to launch up. A slow, gradual rise through the ranks is good. If you do too well, you go too high, and then the competition can get too rough, and you come crashing back down. So once you hit your majority wins, you feel golden, and there can be a general relaxation after that. And so previously, you would have situations where someone had won their 8 already, and on the last day, they're going against someone who's 7-7. And it's easier to give away that win because they don't care about that win at all.
Do you think they give away the win because they are given something or they expect something? Is it actually corrupt, or was it actually corrupt, or was it simply, why should I try?
Yeah, so there was examples of both. So there's stories of wrestlers who, and it's a small world. And they travel together all the time. They know each other intimately, right? They're constantly interacting. So this is not, these are not two big, huge rival groups from halfway across the country. They've traveled together all the time. So they're close. They're acquaintances. They're friends. They're colleagues. They know each other. And so, there have been many reports of people giving away the win. Because they don't need the win and the other person does need it. But then there have been significant examples of match fixing where wrestlers were giving money to other wrestlers to maintain their rank. And that broke a few years ago. And so one of the interesting angles on it is kind of the sumo status within Japan. Sumo is seen as private, but it receives enormous kind of governmental support. And so, for example, the broadcasting of sumo is, to the fan, appropriate, to many Japanese, excessive. The tournaments are, there's 6 tournaments a year. They go 15 days long. They can be 2 to 6 hours a day. So it'd be similar to like PBS or BBC devoting, 2 weeks every other month to showing all afternoon sumo. Just that. And they paid enormous amounts of money to the Japan Sumo Association for the rights to do this. I think it was, last time I saw it was like $5 million a tournament. And so there's enormous kind of governmental support. And so the idea of, they're almost like seen as government employees.
Yeah, no, I see what you're saying. The government is using them as part of the national image in some way.
Yeah, and so when money starts circulating around, then it gets very contentious. And so they've had some issues with money going to the Yakuza, the organized crime. And the connections between sumo and organized crime are complex.
But I don't quite understand that, because is there gambling involved in sumo?
One of the big scandals of the last decade was sumo wrestlers were caught gambling on baseball. And so Japan has enormous routes for gambling, enormous ways of gambling. The wrestlers themselves greatly enjoy gambling. But gambling on baseball is seen as, if you're gambling on baseball, you're gambling with the people who are running it are organized crime.
Right.
And so some wrestlers were caught placing bets with the Yakuza on baseball. And it was an enormous scandal. And so this idea that some of that money came from the government, right? The government is in certain ways subsidizing professional sumo. And these wrestlers are turning around, giving it to organized crime, was seen as this enormous kind of scandal. And wrestlers were kicked out, and stable masters were kicked out because of it. And so, the relationship between the organized crime and all of the entertainment industries within Japan are very, very complex. And in the recent years, there's been an attempt to push out the Yakuza, but the connections between organized crime and the entertainment industry go back centuries. There are really fascinating stories in the early modern period of sumo wrestlers going to a town and the local Yakuza saying, well, if you want to perform in this town, you have to give us half the receipts. And then the wrestlers going to the authorities and saying, well, we're not just your average performance. We're sumo wrestlers and we're connected to the government. And so we should not have to pay the local Yakuza this money. And so there's all of this kind of long history behind it, entertainment venues and things like that.
You've talked a bit about sumo tradition and the sense that they've almost invented a tradition going back, centuries and centuries, and they've invented this brand new tradition really in the last 50 years, and that the real traditions have been somewhat sort of brushed over. But when I read about the scandals, people were saying, well, one of the reasons it's so scandalous is that sumo has this connection to the national religion. And I'm thinking, listening to you, there's something not quite matching there with your description of this sort of brand new sumo tradition and that explanation.
Well, I mean, part of it gets to larger notions of sport. Sports really can reflect the nation and the nation's values. And sports can be this really interesting venue where people debate what it means to be a good citizen or a good member of society. And so notions of sportsmanship are huge throughout the world and exceedingly important within Japan. Japanese fans are famous for their sportsmanship. Like World Cup qualifiers, when Japanese fans go there, they're famous for cleaning up the stands afterwards to show appreciation for the venue. And so, just like American baseball is struggling with a couple scandals right now, sumo is constantly kind of a subject of or a source of scandal. Because just like publics throughout the world, publics love to debate scandal. And Japan has an enormous kind of tabloid culture, huge numbers of tabloids, and they're always looking for scandals. And so, yes, match fixing, and there's been enormous problems. There was one wrestler, he was the subject of hazing, and he was essentially beaten to death. So there are scandalous activities that go on, but partially it's because it is a sport. There's this enormous attention that's paid to it. And it's a way to debate what it means to be a good person. And so when you're talking about tradition and sumo, the definition of how sumo is traditional has changed radically over time. And its ties to the national religion are complex because Shinto doesn't really have a dogma. It doesn't have, there's no Bible to Shinto that lays out all the rules of what it means to be a good Shinto person. So there's a lot of Shinto within sumo, and you could make the argument that it's very deep to sumo, or you could make the argument that it's window dressing. It's part of the performance, it's part of the show. One of the interesting things is, they've really emphasized the referee as being this Shinto priest. Well, part of that was in the beginning of the 20th century, up until 1909, it was this kind of traveling circus, and they wanted to up their reputation, so they got this really important Japanese architect, Tatsuo Kingo, to build the sumo stadium, the Kokugi-kan. And in 1909, they got this huge loan from the government. They put up this massive stadium with seating and a nice roof. And you could bring in diplomats and important people. They could come and watch sumo. In order to make it even a better display, they hired a costumer to research good outfits. And so originally the referees or the gyoji wore kind of the formal outfit of the day, the hakama. but they wanted to make it look special, so they found Ashikaga hunting outfits from like 500 years ago, and they've dressed them up in these really elaborate crazy outfits, and they look great in them. But it's part of this kind of traditionalization of sumo that's going on. And so, depending on the era, early 20th century is very important of turning sumo from this disreputable or this, is a spectacle into something particularly nationalistic. And the more that you tie something to the government, the more it's ripe to like discussions of scandal and citizenship and, what is a good person.
Okay. Well, I think we've probably reached the end of the story, but can you tell me, do you go to Japan fairly regularly?
I was going to go last year. I had bought tickets. I was all set to go, but...
Next year? What about next year?
So this, probably not this summer, but next year I'll definitely go back and see the state of sumo. I've been watching it from afar, but I'm looking forward to going back.
And when's I suppose the season's any time, is it, for sumo?
It's every odd month, so yeah.
Okay, because when I'm next over there, I'm going to find out if you're there and you can take me to a sumo match.
I would love to take you to a sumo match, yes.
That would be great. Anyway, well, thank you very much indeed for today. I just loved that. That was so interesting. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you. I had a wonderful time. This was really quite enjoyable.
Great. Well, that's the end of today's show. I hope you enjoyed listening, and if you did, do please join me for the next episode. And if you have the time, please do recommend me to your friends. And a share on social media, and maybe a review on iTunes really helps my guests get the audience they deserve. Goodbye for now.